president is elected by the Electoral College to make and help make important decisions for the country. He or she must be at least 35 years old, a natural-born citizen, and they must have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years. They can also be referred to as the head of state, chief executive, chief legislator, chief diplomat, and commander-in-chief. In some nations, the chief of state is a king or queen who wears a crown on special occasions, celebrates national holidays, and stands for the highest values and ideals of the country. As head of state, the president does ceremonial and symbolic duties. These might include awarding medals to the winners of college scholarships, congratulating astronauts on their journey into space, greeting visitors into the White House, and making a patriotic speech on the 4th of July. The president is also the head of the executive branch. He decides how the laws of the United States are to be enforced and chooses officials and advisors to help run the executive branch. Some examples of his responsibilities as the chief executive are appointing someone to serve as head of CIA, holding a cabinet meeting to discuss government business, and reading reports about problems of the FBI. As chief legislator, the president can't make laws, but he can urge Congress to pass new laws and veto bills that he doesn't like. Examples of responsibilities of the president as chief legislator are inviting members of Congress to lunch in the White House and signing a bill of Congress. The president decides what American diplomats and ambassadors say to foreign governments. He also creates the foreign policy with help from advisors and cabinet members. He may travel to London to meet with British leaders, or entertain Japanese diplomats in the White House, or write a message or letter to the leaders of Russia. As commander-in-chief, the president is in charge of the military. All military generals and admirals take their orders from the president. The differences between the president and prime ministers. Presidents are often outsiders. Many presidential candidates find that it's easier to win an election by distancing themselves from the mess of Washington. On the other hand, prime ministers are selected by Parliament, so they are always insiders. Sitting members of Congress cannot hold office in the executive branch, so no members of Congress are part of the president's cabinet. On the contrary, prime ministers almost always choose members of Parliament for the cabinet. Prime ministers always have the majority in Parliament. If they did not have the majority, they would not be prime minister. Presidents often battle with Congress over political views. The differences between a president and a prime minister can be demonstrated by George W. Bush and Tony Blair. Once Bush decided to fight in the war, he then had to get the support of Congress. Once Blair decided to fight in the war, Parliament couldn't do much to stop him. When the public turned against George W. Bush, he kept fighting because he could not be removed from office. When the same thing happened to Blair, he resigned and someone else took over as prime minister. Divided government means that one party controls the White House and a different party controls one or both houses of Congress. Unified government means that one party controls the White House and the same party controls both houses of Congress. A gridlock is an inability of the government to act because rival parties control different parts of the government. An example of this would be the shutdown that we experienced earlier this year. It seems that gridlocks are just as likely to occur in unified governments as they are in divided governments. Wilson calls this a consequence of having checks and balances. Some powers that only the president has are commander-in-chief. Only he can commission officers of the armed forces. Granting reprieves and pardons for federal offenses. Excluding impeachment. Convening with Congress in special sessions and receiving ambassadors. Powers that he shares with the Senate are making treaties and appointing ambassadors, judges, and high officials. One power that he shares with Congress as a whole is approving legislation. The framers' frame of mind. 1787, the framers did not yet know how they wanted to select the president or how much power to give him. They were afraid of giving the central government too much power, but they needed it to be stronger than it was. They also knew that they didn't want a direct democracy, because they were afraid that it would be too difficult to achieve a majority vote. They also didn't want Congress to elect the president, because they didn't want that branch of the government to become too involved with the executive branch. Eventually, the Committee of Postponed Matters came up with the Electoral College. The evolution of the presidency. The Electoral College. States choose electors however they want. These electors vote on who they think the president should be. In the event that the Electoral College fails, the House votes. The winner of this vote would be president. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the first and only president to serve more than 2 terms. After his 3rd term, the 22nd Amendment was passed. Now, a president can only serve 2 terms, plus 2 years of another president's term.
Power in Congress has been balanced against the power of the presidency, and it's sort of moved back and forth between who would be in most policy-making power, political power in our government. So the very first presidents really deferred to Congress and mostly got their appointments confirmed from Congress. Congress would be the policy-making branch. The president would be there to dutifully execute the Congress's will, and that the president was not the primary policy maker, and that when the president wanted congressional appointments to be confirmed, they were mostly confirmed. We see the rise of Andrew Jackson. And we're going to see the very first modern campaign for president, that Andrew Jackson is going to appeal to the American people as electing him as being sort of an outsider from New England, and he's going to sort of take the presidency by storm. And as a part of his election or his campaign promises, he inserts into the bureaucracy a lot of his cronies, a lot of the people who helped him to get elected, and sort of introduces this spoils system into government, whereby government officials were handpicked by the president as a reward for political loyalty. President Jackson engages in more presidential vetoes, I think, than his previous presidents all combined. The president ignored the Supreme Court. The president started to become more of a policymaker, more of a national figure who was orchestrating policy nationwide. As a reaction to that, we're going to see a reemergence of Congress at the latter half of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. The Congress saw the president as being a hugely negative force, one that was trying to take on the role of a powerful policy-making president, and that Congress did not like that. They wanted to counteract that as much as possible and try to hinder the president's policy-making power. There were a huge number of vetoes by the president against the Congress. Congress wanted to reassert themselves as the initiator of policy. Then in the 20th century, we're going to see the contemporary mold of the president, which is one who was, by the advent of crises and wars and media, we're going to see the reemergence of the powerful president. Some would say the imperial president, especially with America emerging as a global power. And it's likely going to remain that way, considering the role of the media and the role of campaigning, that the increasing complexity of problems in both nationally and internationally. We're seeing presidents who we're familiar with, we can recognize, they're on TV, they're crafting legislation, they're campaigning with promises of what they're going to do to change or to improve America, and they're taking leadership roles and positions both in domestic policy and also in international policy as well.
The office of the president. There are 3 ways a president can organize his personal staff. The first is the pyramid structure, where the president's subordinates report to him through a clear chain of command. Next is the circular structure, where several assistants report directly to him. Lastly, the ad hoc structure is where several subordinates, cabinet officers, and committees report directly to the president on different matters. Agencies in the executive office report directly to the president and perform staff services for him. They are not located in the White House. Some principal agencies in the executive office are Office of Management and Budget, Director of National Intelligence, and Council of Economic Advisors. The Cabinet are the heads of the 15 executive branch departments. In conclusion, the presidency is very important, but can be very boring, especially when you've already learned all the important stuff and it's read to you in this monotone voice.